Good evening. I'm Bob Michael, a co-chair of the Committee on Middle Eastern and North African Affairs of the New York City Bar Association. And I want to thank you for coming to our program on current issues for women's rights in the Middle East and North African region. We are particularly grateful to the co-sponsorship of this program by the Council on International Affairs and the Committees on African Affairs, Asian Affairs, Foreign and Comparative Law, International Law, Section Law, the United Nations, and women in the legal profession of this association, as well as the American Bar Association's International Law section. Now, I may seem out of place in this wonderfully diverse dais and on this topic, but it is in fact the third program in this august hall that I've organized and moderated on a similar topic over the last 15 years or so. That is because the subject matter combines two very important aspects of my past, present, and future: influential women and the Middle East and North African Islamic law. The first part I share with many of you, being influenced by exceptional women. In my case, it started with my maternal grandmother, who was one of the few female college students in Moscow during the Russian Revolution, and who I cited as an authority on the breakdown of conventional mores among the Bolsheviks in my college thesis on collectivization. Grandma spelled party both with a capital P and a lowercase p. My paternal grandmother was a fierce feminist. She founded the first home for unwed mothers in Berlin in 1922. And when both of them, very separately, had to flee the Nazis from Germany in the 30s, so did my teenage mother, who had to give up the dream of being a doctor like her father, an OB-GYN, of course. That was also about the time when my mother-in-law, as a young fashion designer, had the brilliant insight that teenage girls had different body types than women or children, and invented Junior Miss. Many years later, having become a multi-published Coty Award winner and founder and trustee of FIT, she had another great insight in showing a photo of her only daughter to a first-year lawyer she was sitting next to on a flight to San Diego. 8 months later, that daughter became my wife of now 47 years. Another exceptional woman who has had 2 books and innumerable newspaper and magazine articles published and hosts weekly podcasts on health, beauty, and fitness. It also led to our daughter, who is now a successful hedge fund lawyer, and whose wedding dinner was held in this room as part of the first formal wedding ever held in this then 122-year-old national landmark building. She isn't here tonight because she's 8 months pregnant with my 4th granddaughter. Almost equally influential, though, have been the exceptional women I have had the opportunity to work with and meet professionally. And tonight we have the best of the best here on the panel, starting, of course, with the now almost legendary Tawakkol Karman, the only Arab woman Nobel Peace Prize Laureate, and someone I am incredibly proud to claim as my friend. There is my brilliant co-chair, United States bankruptcy judge Elizabeth Stong. Finally, there are the wonderful young women I've had the privilege to teach as a law professor and or mentor and or supervise professionally. My very 2 favorites are also here tonight, starting with our panelist, who you will get to meet on screen, Norah Altaweel Al-Otaibi, one of the many Saudi Arabian women lawyers I've had the good fortune to have taught or mentored. And right here is Julia Scherbach, the Secretary of the Committee on Middle Eastern and North African Affairs, and my legal assistant at Standard Power, who has been invaluable in bringing this program to you tonight. Thank you, Julia. Now, my interest in Islamic law in the MENA region isn't quite as long-standing, but it does go all the way back to 1980. I was then in the Paris office of Sherman and Sterling and was given the task of drafting the model loan documents, what we would now call templates, for Saudi American Bank, under Saudi, therefore Islamic law. However, no one had ever tried to draft Sharia-compliant loan documents, since the charging and paying of interest is both a sin and a crime under all forms of Islamic law. My solution might be elegantly called the product of the hermeneutical approach. I've been called the godfather of Islamic finance because I came up with the idea of calling interest commission. Somehow it worked, and it became the cornerstone of many forms of Islamic finance. Although when I asked our local counsel in Riyadh for an opinion that that would work, they said they couldn't assure us that it would. So I said, what would happen if the Saudi officials decide it didn't work? Well, they said they could cut off the hands of the loan officer. So that's when I decided that was a closing I was not going to attend. It took 25 years after that for me to have the opportunity to utilize this experience, to when I had the honor to be appointed the chair of the Committee on Foreign and Comparative Law of this association. I used that platform to present programs on Islamic law then and here, over a dozen all told. Along the way, due to the strong initiative and support of our late and deeply missed past president, Betsy Plevin, whose painting is on the wall there, the association decided to carve out of our African Affairs and Asian Affairs Committee a MENA Committee, with yours truly as its first chair. The pandemic was a blow to all of us, everywhere and every way. One of its lesser blows was to devastate membership in committees of this association, including, of course, the Committee on Middle Eastern and North African Affairs. So, albeit reluctantly, and only if I could enlist someone as forceful and talented as Judge Stong as co-chair, I agreed to return as a co-chair. But thanks to that, I am once again proud and honored to be able to present tonight this exciting and timely and informative program for you. So with that, it is therefore my great pleasure, hopefully we can get her on the screen, to introduce Norah Altaweel, who is coming to us from London, where it is after midnight, so we will start with her. Norah has a law degree from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and has an LLM in environmental law from Pace Law School. A human rights activist, Norah was also a legal advisor to the Grenada mission to the UN and was the secretary of the Islamic Law Committee of the American branch of the International Law Association for the 4 years that I chaired that committee. Norah will discuss the continuing challenges facing Saudi women. And there she is.
Hi, Bob. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Bob and thank Judge Stong for giving me the opportunity tonight to speak on the continuing challenges facing Saudi women and the women's rights violations. I would also like to, thank all of you for coming, to this panel discussion. And excuse, I have a minor infection, so don't worry about it. But nothing was like making me not to attend such opportunity, and also for giving me actually to be with you here virtually. My name is Norah Altaweel. I was a SJD student at the Law School of St. Thomas University in Miami, doing my SJD until the spring 2022, when the Saudi culture discontinued my scholarship for speaking up against the human rights violation committed against my grandmother, who passed away in 2021, and against the violation that committed against me. So apparently, we have an issue of freedom of speech, even if you claim you're right. Today, I'm going to talk about the women's rights violation continue to be committed by the hypocrite Saudi regime, if I may call it. In the past, we had a broken legal system, we know it. Women lack any women's rights or human rights. But somehow women managed to survive through this broken legal system. At least we know what was on the table. But now with the unexpected changes came to the royal family in Saudi when the son of the king, Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, came as the crown prince, taking this position from his cousin, Mohammed bin Naif, who is now actually detained in his own palace in Riyadh, tortured, of course. A lot of changes happen, and one of them actually the crown prince, who are referred to as MBS, announces, women's reforms and call himself as a women rights reformer. In this panel, I would like to discuss the reforms on both women's and human rights, but let me start with the human rights reforms very quick. So the Saudi prince, who called himself a reformer, under the MBS ruling, there was a widespread of arrest for women and men. It was claimed to be a war against extremists, but in the fact, there are a lot of women among those people who were arrested, people who neither be religious or corrupted. There are actually a normal guy who went to prison for 5 years just for tweeting what he was feeling. So what the so-called war against extremism and war against corruption became war against anyone who speak their political view peacefully. So this is very, to me, hypocritical, very unusual. Yes, we never had freedom of expression before, but we had a little window where we can at least say what we feel about what's going on, whether it's women or something social or commercial. Nowadays, if anyone actually criticizes anything, be it anything social or legal or anything, they would be actually arrested and detained. Also, if you express, if I express my opinion on Twitter saying anything, that would be actually a crime under MBS ruling. So there was also an interview I wanted to share with you with a guy. This interview actually aired in the Saudi TV with a man who says he went to prison for 5 years and his inmate, had a 15 years just for a couple of tweets of what they feel. The same interview was deleted later because it was against them. Unfortunately, the aim of the interview was to scare the public of Saudi people so they don't, criticize anything. But, thanks for the human rights organization and anyone who works for human rights and women's rights who actually took the recording of this video and then, we actually condemned what the Saudi regime is doing. Later on, the interview was deleted. Now you cannot find it. It's only recorded by some human rights organization. So I really don't know which part of this is a human rights reforms or what this, regime is doing that will actually enhance the well-being of Saudi people. This is insane. I think, Saudi now, like North Korea and those countries who's like, you cannot even say anything. Back in 2013, I was in the same panel discussion and I was able to discuss and, criticize. Nothing happened to me back then. But now, just because I claimed my right and I wanted to get the rights that these reforms actually granted, I was punished and my scholarship was discontinued. And I was also received almost every day threats of killing. So based on what I says is, it's clearly these human rights reforms do not exist. In reality, the human rights violation got worse and worse. That's the reality, which you will not hear it in the Saudi media news. And again, I repeat, what once was a war against corruption became an excuse for corruption. I want to also highlight the legal broken system under MBS ruling, which is really important. We thought we have reforms and everyone can go and have their rights, but actually the judges are not doing their job. They're existed just to serve the MBS and his fellow, and one of them is actually my family. The second issue is women's rights. As the MBS announced many women's rights reform, which supposedly protect women and empower them, yet these laws and reforms are just whitewashing strategy. So the West and the world would forget the horrible crime of Jamal Khashoggi assassination. Under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi regime continue imprisonment of women for their peaceful expression in support of women's rights and impose travel ban against women human rights defender such as Lujain al-Hudlul. Lujain al-Hudlul is a women's rights defender. She called for the lifting of the ban of women driving. She was imprisoned for 3 years just for calling for women's rights and driving, which indicate and expose the discrimination system against women that still continue to happen. Another woman who's also a rights activist, Salma Shihab, she's a student who actually doing her PhD studies in Leeds University here in the UK. She went to visit her family on vacation. That was in 2021, and she was arrested. She was jailed for 34 years over tweets. Yes, she didn't call for the abolish of the monarchy or a protest or anything. She just expressed her feeling and her political view on a couple of tweets, and she was arrested and sentenced for 34 years. So I don't know what women's rights actually is happening in Saudi Arabia. This has never happened before. Also, another major issue, which is domestic abuse. The new reforms of women fail to protect women from domestic abuse violence. Instead, these new laws enable gender discrimination by giving the guardianship more powers, such as guardianship approval for marriage. So the woman cannot actually get married until she gets approval from her guardianship for the marriage to be actually valid. Also, there is an issue for this, which is, the woman can be married with the approval in the beginning, which this is one of the case happened. And then later on, like a year or two, the father changes his mind for whatever reason. Could be a fight with his daughter, could be, a dispute for money or something like that. And he could actually go and file a lawsuit in the court and call this marriage, terminated for a stupid reason, like, the man is not qualified for the family. This is still happening actually in the Saudi courts. So again, these reforms is only on paper, and it's actually for advertisement purposes for the West to see that we do have changes. Also, another setback, which is the law sets the legal age for marriage to be 18. However, some courts allow marriage to be under 18 in certain circumstances and cases. So I wonder what cases can allow the father, force his daughter, whatever, even if it's not forced, to be married under 18. Like, this is a teenage kids. So the only actually certain cases or certain circumstances that could be valid for, you know, for a father to, you know, let his daughter marry under 18, which is usually happen by force. It's not by, you know, the girl would be forced. It's not published. There's no guidelines for it. There's nothing, you know, what are these certain cases that allow the father to, you know, make his daughter or boy marry before the age of 18. But from my own experience, I can tell you that this is an exception only for the royal families and their fellow to have daughters or to marry a woman under 18 years old. Also, I want to highlight actually the report of the Amnesty International report. So according to their report, which actually was published on May 8th of this year, they examined the personal status law in Saudi Arabia. And even though, you know, it says 1 year ago, that was like actually in 2022, March 8th, the Saudi Arabia personal status law passed, you know, a major reform by the authorities, perpetuating the male guardian system and codifies discrimination against women in most aspects of family life. Amnesty International found that these reforms failed to protect women from domestic violence and actually enriches a system of gender-based discrimination in marriage, divorce, custody, and inheritance. Also, the personal status law encourages gender roles by expecting women to obey their husband and made financial support conditional to women's submission to her husband. So in order for a woman to get a financial support from her husband, there is a condition for it that she has to obey him. I mean, and there's no like guideline or anything. But this actually can lead to, you know, what they call it, exploitation, which is a dangerous thing. Also, in initiating a divorce, a man has the power to initiate the divorce anytime for no reason. There is no reason to submit anything that as why he wants to end the marriage. However, the woman needs to submit a valid reason why she's asking for a divorce, and emotional reasons are not considered, unfortunately. So getting divorced is not an obstacle for a man, but it's a still huge obstacle for a woman. But there are many other major issues, such as domestic violence, as we mentioned, incest, which is a huge taboo in Saudi Arabia. Incest is actually rising, and the cases are getting much cases. But however, since it's a huge taboo in Saudi Arabia, nobody actually wants to talk about it. The legal system never, you know, brought any laws to fix this issue. And always the victims are the one to blame. They would blame the victim for it. They would accuse her. They would even, you know, ruin her reputation or accuse her of really bad things just to justify the man harasser. And usually it's one of the family member. As example of that, which is my case, I spoke about it publicly, my domestic abuse and my also sexual harassment, which happened back in the days before I leave Saudi Arabia. And I was hugely attacked by MBS trolls. The dangerous things here is that the most attack against women like me and the rest of the victims is actually held and, you know, carried out by MBS agents. They troll women, attacking them, defame them, name it, which is, really dangerous. All of these is a way and a tool just to silence women. They no longer want any woman to complain or ask for her rights. They only want everyone to say, oh, this is this is like heaven, we have no problem, everything is fine, which is insane. It's actually indicate like this government is a psychopath government. Because if you cannot, tolerate any kind of criticism, that's not a healthy situation. All countries have their, downsides, have corruption, domestic abuse, and so forth. And they do discuss this, and they do find solution for it. The Saudi government now, under MBS, do not want to hear any sort of criticism whatsoever. And if you do, you're probably going to jail. This is a totally psychopath regime. So again, these reforms, it's only on paper. Nobody actually see it in reality. And there is also a lot of media attention on the positive of these reforms. Now, many women, including me, fall victim on such fake reforms. We were promised that if we come along and report any violation, we would be granted protection and justice. But in reality, when I tried to file a lawsuit against my abuser, I was denied access to legal system. And on top of that, I was threatened to be killed if I don't keep my mouth shut. Now, many of you may wonder, then what about the women we see in the media? What about the women who are appointed as ambassadors, or the women who are representatives in foreign countries? Well, there is explanation for it. Those women are already empowered by their family long time before MBS come to the office. They are empowered by their family. Their family mostly come from liberated, highly educated family. So there is actually nothing to do for MBS. All he did is just pick up those women and hire them. But the majority of women in Saudi Arabia is from conservative family, from conservative tribes. So those are the one who needs these reforms in reality. However, there is no implementation for it. And also in terms of law enforcement, there is no enforcement of these, reforms. That's why I keep saying it's just reforms in paper. There is no application for these reforms in reality.
Thank you, Norah. That's very compelling. Then thank you for
I
being
would
with us.
like, if you can just
Norah,
give me...
we don't have any more time. We have other people.
One last time.
Okay,
One last point. I appreciate it. I want to highlight the point transactional repression for women, which is when we speak against any of these violations, actually what happened is that the government attack those defenders even abroad. So inside the Saudi kingdom is jailed, abroad is attacking them, and there are a lot of women I would like to mention, but there is no time, so I will leave the rest of the time for the speaker. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. There's a lot to say, but I will just stop right now for the time. Hello?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now I have the extraordinary honor and privilege to present our next speaker, Nobel Peace Prize Laureate Tawakkol Karman. It almost seems superfluous to add anything after Nobel Peace Prize Laureate. But incredible as it is, Tawakkol is so much more. We, of course, do not have time to list all of her accomplishments, but Wikipedia does an okay job of that. You should know that while she is most famous for being the energizing voice of the Yemen Arab Spring, since then her main focus has been in founding and developing her foundation and the globally influential Women Journalists Without Chains. Please welcome my friend and inspiration, Tawakkol Karman.
Thank you, my friend Bob. I'm so happy to be here again in New York City Bar. I had the privilege to give a speech here years ago with my colleagues Lima Boy from Liberia and Judy Williams from America and Shirin Abadi from Iran. So this is a very important moment to speak with you again, and also to focus about women's issues in the Middle East and North Africa. And really, I don't know if Nawal is with us, but really a lot of thanks to Nawal and to her, remarks, which is really, really inspiration, and which is also give us a look about what is the priority of women in Middle East and North Africa, and in particular in Arab region. Look, most of the speech of Nawal was about human rights in general, was about expression rights in general, which about the right of people to access to democracy, to access to justice. And women's rights is just one side of all rights that we women in the Middle East looking for. So the priority of women issues is differ from countries to countries, from Arab to Africa to Middle East in general to the West to America. But the real priority for women in our region is democracy. This is the real priority. The real priority and the real struggle of women in our countries is the struggle against dictatorship, is the struggle for democracy, is the struggle for reaching to the rule of law. It's the struggle for reaching to the freedom. So the tyranny use dictatorship system against all his citizens, women and men. So when we talk about women's rights in our region, we started with the democracy rights. So there is no way to divide between women's rights and human rights in general. It will be something luxury. So every woman who wants to reach to women's rights in our countries should start with the fight and struggle against dictatorship system. And this is what happened with the Arab Spring. People went to the streets peacefully, women and men, raising their voice against the dictatorship, against the bad, against the bad policy of the dictatorship system, authoritarian regimes toward even, women's rights. Let's go to the Saudi Arabia as a model. Before Mohammed bin Salman, taking, the power in Saudi, there was all Saudi was ruled by which called Islamic rules. And they said that Islamic rules, Islamic Sharia, prevent women from its rights and started with the driving rights. And they said, this is Sharia, this is Islam say that. It's haram to do that. Under the slogan of Islam. And when he came, they said, no, Islam didn't say that. Islam said it's halal. So this is just an example how authoritarian regime uses the religion against their people. When they want to say it's haram, it's haram. When they want to say it's halal, it's halal. So our struggle in our region, as I said, started with the fighting tyrannies. that collapsed all the field around us. And even they are using our religion in a bad way. And I'll give you many, many examples of the, of the struggle of women in the region for freedom, democracy, and how she paid a lot to reach to the moment of achieving democracy. And how did she achieve, not just as a woman, as a citizen with her, colleague, with her brother in the street, especially in Arab Spring countries. But who let down women in the region? What happened in Arab countries? What happened? The international community, the Western governments, America authority, let women down. They betrayed women's rights, they betrayed human rights, and they make allies with the dictatorship in the region. They make allies with leader of counter-revolution in our countries. We did a great revolution against dictatorship. We did a great successful steps toward democracy, toward peace, toward equality, toward women's rights, toward children's rights, etc., etc. But suddenly everything collapsed. In Egypt, in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, not Syria, we can exclude, in Tunis, and now in Sudan. And all this collapse came from the leader of counter-revolution, from Saudi Arabia, from Emirates, and from Iran. Those three countries who led the counter-revolution against democracy, against women, against citizens. They led an ugly counter-revolution against people. They waged wars, they waged coups, they waged military, coups. Militia, they supported militia, they supported terrorism. So these three countries who led the counter-revolution as a revenge from people who aspire for democracy and for equality and for rule of law. But on the other hand, there is conspiracy from the Western governments. Supported these regimes on their battle against their people. Also, US, UK, also all of them, unfortunately, they were afraid from change in our countries. They just announced that we are with women's rights, and when women go to the street claiming, struggling, sacrificing for her right, they let her down. Then they supported Mohammed bin Salman, and they supported Al-Sisi in Egypt, and they supported Qais bin Ali, Qais bin Said in Tunis, the dictator of Tunisia. And they supported all the dictatorship, directly and indirectly. So the problems that we face as a woman is the counter-revolution led by Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Emirates, and at the same time, the betrayal of the Western governments. Now in Sudan now, after their, peaceful revolution against al-Bashir, now Sudan facing a civil war. And international community, the Western governments, label this war as war between parties. They didn't describe it as it is. There is a coup, there is a militia coup against the army, against the state. Yes, we are not me as Tawakkol, who belong to the peaceful revolution, I am against the army and the militia in general from the beginning when they make coup against peaceful revolution. But now there is a civil war. There is a civil war. So there is no real description of what is happening in Tunis. The same thing in Iran. When the people revolt against Malali, against Mullah, against Ayatollah, there wasn't enough support for people in Iran against their regime. In Yemen, we are now facing an ugly war since 8 years, 8 years of ugly war. And this ugly war came after our great successful revolution against the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh and our great successful transitional period with a great national dialogue. But Houthi militia, backed by Iran, took over the country, occupied the capital, and there was silence. And there was some kind of conspiracy from some of the Western governments. And also after that, the war waged by Saudi and Emirates, also there was some conspiracy from the Western governments. They supported Saudi Arabia and Emirates, and they sell them the weapons that they kill Yemenis. So if you want to talk about women's rights in this region, you should know that women are struggling enough and sacrificing enough for reaching to their rights, which is started with democracy. But they are alone because all this conspiracy, regional and from international. And the last point that I want to speak about the situation in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, there was a little achievement of women's rights under the little. It's not that much notice until, under the occupation of America. But even with that, America left everything in Afghanistan and handed over Afghanistan to Taliban. And they destroyed all the small progress of women's rights, especially in education. So I don't want just, yes, I can blame ourselves as women movement, as human rights activists, as revolutionary people in our region, in our countries, but at the same time, you should know that America and you and Western government didn't fulfill their commitment to support human rights, to support women's rights. They just made some occupation, and they waged their occupations against people, and they let people, and they promised for democracy, like what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then they destroy everything and they leave. And on the other hand, they support dictatorships directly and indirectly, and that harm people inside the countries. Last thing that we as women in the region, and as I said, that our main priority is to reach to democracy, to reach to human rights, and women's rights. We will not reach to women's rights if there is no democracy. We will not reach to women's rights if there is no expression rights. And we are calling for justice. Those world war leaders should be punished. We are now here in the New York City Bar, and we have to make a good collaboration to put those dictators in jail. Accountability should prevail. So all those war leaders should be punished. In Yemen, we are calling for international tribunal Special International Tribunal for Yemen, and we are calling for the International Criminal Court to do its work to, against, all this, war criminals in the world, especially in Yemen, started with Bashar al-Assad and all other, leaders that destroyed our countries. Thank you so much.
People wonder how someone, a young woman from a country like Yemen, becomes a Nobel Peace Prize Laureate. That's how. Our next speaker has not been awarded a Nobel Peace Prize yet. Rose Parris Richter has already had an extraordinary career as Chief of Staff for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief and a Senior Advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. And along the way, she found time to found Impact Iran, of which she is Executive Director. It is a coalition of 14 Iranian human rights organizations advocating for heightened international responses to the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And as she just told me, it has just been given the distinct honor of being called a terrorist organization by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. You're known by your enemies. Her topic, of course, is the issues facing Iran's women today. Rose.
Thank you so much. Very tough act to follow. Good evening, everyone. I guess I'll just start by saying that for years, I think many of you know that Iran has been facing a severe human rights crisis with discrimination and persecution of women at its core. The Iranian government explicitly refuses to recognize gender equality and systematically denies women their fundamental human rights. The country's legal code is based on Islamic Sharia law, which is interpreted in such a way that it regulates women to second-class citizens. For example, Iranian law does not recognize equal rights in marriage, divorce, and inheritance for women. A woman's testimony is considered half as valuable as a man's in court, and women's legal guardianship is vested in her husband or her father. Women are underrepresented in politics and in business and face frequent discrimination in hiring and pay. Of course, what you'll hear this evening from others will be similar in terms of the experiences of women across the region. The law also justifies the regime's increasing involvement in citizens' private lives. Under the country's compulsory hijab laws, women and girls are forced to wear headscarves. And from an early age, in school and in public places, teenagers and young people in Iran are routinely stopped by the morality police, who are responsible for policing people's appearance and their adherence to wearing the hijab. For women, this means how they wear their headscarves and the length of their overcoats. And for men, they're prohibited from wearing shorts, having certain haircuts that would be seen as Western, or wearing tops with Western patterns or writings. In recent years, it has become common practice for the police to raid private parties, arresting both girls and boys on the basis of not adhering to the hijab laws. Now, compulsory veiling laws are firmly established in the country's legal framework, and under the Islamic Penal Code, any behavior that is deemed offensive to public morality is met with a penalty of 10 days to 2 months in prison or 74 lashes. The law also extends to young girls, as the minimum age of criminal responsibility in Iran is 9. 2 weeks ago, 10 UN experts, including the UN Special Rapporteurs on the human rights situation in Iran and on freedom of religion or belief, denounced the repressive enforcement of Iran's hijab laws, labeling them draconian and coercive, and their coercive enforcement a blatant form of gender-based discrimination. Now, this condemnation comes in response to announcements that were recently made by security officials that the government is contemplating new measures for enforcing the country's compulsory hijab laws. New enforcement measures will enable authorities to use surveillance cameras and face recognition tools to identify and arrest women and detain girls at their discretion. Those detained must sign a written document promising not to repeat the offense, and women who refuse to sign or comply with the mandatory veiling could be placed under surveillance, subject to travel restrictions for up to a year, disqualified from government or public positions, and denied access to public institutions, including hospitals and schools, government buildings, and airports. They could be deprived of social services, such as a cell phone line, mobile internet access, their bank accounts may be frozen, and their cars impounded. The rules would also extend to managers and business owners who will effectively act as police to enforce the compulsory veiling in the event of non-compliance by female employees. Now, this news comes after 6 months of protests and acts of civil disobedience sparked by accounts of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini's arrest by Iran's morality police for improperly wearing her hijab, and as the photographs captured by a brave journalist, Niloufar Hamedi, for capturing Amini lying brain dead in her hospital bed and her devastated family in the hallways embracing. Now, Ms. Hamedi was arrested for her efforts to report the incident and remains in Evin prison today. Now, scenes from the countrywide protests that many of us saw unfolding included Iranian women burning their hijabs and cutting their hair to challenge the laws and practices that led Mahsa Amini and many women before her to lose their lives. Human rights organizations have reported thousands of arrests at the hands of police, and 12 weeks later, after these protests began, the government executed Mohsen Sakari on December 8th, the first person to be executed in connection with the protests. He was hanged following his conviction on the charge of waging war against God. Now, dozens of other protesters have received death sentences in recent months, and like Mohsen, their forced confessions will be aired on state media in the days before facing their charges in hasty sham trials overseen by the revolutionary courts, which are designed to instill fear and suppress the widespread protests rather than adjudicate justice. I also should say that in terms of access to legal counsel during these trials, there is very little, if any. And it's been recently reported that up to 60 lawyers have been arrested in Iran and remain detained today, many of them famous for defending women's rights activists and human rights advocates. In recent months, human rights monitors have seen a 75% increase in executions being carried out by the government. And this has alarmed many of us, who've concluded that the government is using this tactic to instill fear among those who may express dissent against the regime. What's troubling is that most of those that are convicted most of those that were executed were convicted of drug offenses, which begs the question as to whether these executions are about justice or simply about maintaining power. Now, the government in 2015 and 2016 promised and even adopted new laws to stop executing low-level drug offenders. Now, as some of my colleagues in the field have pointed out, these individuals are the low-cost victims of the Islamic regime's policy of governing by fear and force. The government likely believes that executing these individuals will cause less international condemnation, but do the job of instilling fear in the population. But now, half a year has passed since these protests began, and Iran's attempts to quell the protests have proven unsuccessful. In fact, many are now calling the past few months of civil disobedience a full-blown revolution. And like many, my colleagues and I that were closely monitoring these protests asked ourselves why we felt these protests were different from all the others that came before. the student protests of 1999, the urban middle class-led green movement of 2009, the 2017 protests over water scarcity, and the 2019 protests over rising fuel prices, which brought poor and middle working classes together in their display of resentment over the dissatisfaction with their economic hardship. But all of these protests failed to enact lasting change. These protests, however, we opined in our offices, stand in stark contrast to these past demonstrations. These demonstrations embody a different type of resistance that appears at a new point in the continuum of Iran's history of spectacles of mass outrage, frustration, and pain. We agreed that these protests were different because they were largely driven by women from all socioeconomic strata, representing every ethnic, racial, and religious demographic that forms Iran's national tapestry, united by the shared desire to live in dignity and freedom, which fueled the spread of these protests across 31 of Iran's provinces, and signaling the emergence of a nationwide rejection of the oppressive government and its unpopular form of rule. The widespread nature of these protests in both big cities and small towns also presents a major obstacle for security forces who have reportedly been struggling to maintain a strong presence in areas experiencing unrest. In the past, the government could easily crush protests that were mainly confined to the larger cities, allowing security forces to focus their efforts on a few locations. However, responding to protests in multiple locations simultaneously demands more resources and a sustained effort. These protests also come at the end of a long and embattled road, marked by the trials and errors of movements that vested in personalities promising reform from within, only to be delivered disillusionment. Iranians have lost their faith in the promise of institutional reforms delivering a better future. And so these protests have evolved into a call for regime change, not just reforms, as all segments of Iranian society denounce the oppressive restrictions on their freedoms. Most importantly, throughout the recent uprising, Amini's identity as a Kurdish woman has played a crucial role in creating an inclusive alliance. Gender and ethnicity have become integral components of the movement, uniting religious, sexual, and gender minorities with suppressed ethnicities such as Kurds, Arabs, Turks, Baluch, and others. And Amini's influence has inspired individuals to unite and fight for their common cause, regardless of their differences. Now, I wanted to say that the hijab has received a preponderance of the attention that the protests, a preponderance of the international community, it's the media and analysts. This is especially true since Iranian women were taking to the streets with their veils and scarves ablaze. Iranian rights activists have been clear, though, that their unflinching their unflinching struggle in the face of lethal violence these last 6 months is not a fight against the hijab per se. These groundbreaking protests, yanking off their hijab before this and in protests before, as my colleague said, are an explicit rejection of the way the government uses the hijab, the way that it wields the hijab against women as a tool to exclude them from various areas of public life, either by explicitly banning women from certain public spaces such as sports stadiums, or by adding restrictions on their education and workplace. More generally, it's used to exclude anyone who disagrees with the regime's ideology and those who are branded as having bad hijab. Throughout Iranian history, the politicization of the hijab has transformed it into more than just a religious symbol. It has become intertwined with the political and social landscapes of the country and represents the power relations between the genders and the state. Now, women and their dress have become a marker of modernization and a battleground for political factions aiming to shape the country's direction. In the 20th century, the Pahlavi dynasty forced women to remove their veils as part of their modernization effort, and refusal to comply was met with sometimes violent enforcement and a removal of the offending garment. Now, during the Islamic Revolution, publicly wearing your hijab became a symbol of protest and solidarity against the monarchy, regardless of how religious a woman was. After the Islamic Revolution, the hijab became mandatory for women under Islamic law, signaling the values of the new Islamic regime and the rejection of the old. Now, consequently, the bodies of Iranian women, as in many other societies, became the site where pre- and post-revolutionary governments in Iran enacted their modernization and Islamization policies. For many women, the hijab is neither a tool of suppression nor oppression, but its significance lies in the freedom it symbolizes for Iranian women to express themselves and assert their rights. The hijab's enforcement or its removal represents much more than religious practice. It signifies the freedom of Iranian women to exercise their agency and express their individuality. It represents their right to practice their beliefs without fear or of suppression or oppression. And it represents their fight to assert their rights and self-expression in a society that often seeks to stifle their voices. The compulsory hijab mandate in Iran cannot be viewed in isolation from the country's socioeconomic and political challenges. The fact that the Iranian regime has deployed thousands of morality police agents to implement its strict Islamic code shows that the hijab is one of the main pillars of the Islamic Republic. And that when women face severe punishment, for removing their scarves in public, it should come as no surprise to any of us that workers are sent to prison and flogged for demanding their months of delayed wages, or that ethnic or religious minorities are persecuted for their peaceful activities. Resistance to the compulsory hijab in the context of Iran, therefore, is not just a matter of fashion or individual preference, but a reflection of a broader socio-political struggle for freedom, justice, and democracy in the country. And by standing against the compulsory hijab, this movement has the potential to contribute to a broader paradigm shift in Iran, where the government's ideology is challenged at its core. Now, since the protests have began and advanced, that we've seen a lot of different innovative actions, either on the ground or online. But the lack of respect for human rights in Iran and the absence of national institutions for holding perpetrators of human rights violations and crimes accountable leave Iranians unable to seek justice or to challenge their ability to advance change. Past and present human rights violations in Iran remain largely unaddressed, and those responsible for such abuses continue to act with impunity while holding positions of power. In the face of these challenges, many Iranians have turned to the international community for support. And using various strategies and advocacy actions, diaspora Iranian human rights defenders seek to mobilize support for effective international interventions that promotes respect for human rights, that advance accountability and justice in the country, and that isolates Iran as it contends with its crisis of legitimacy both at home and abroad. Now, last October, for example, 43 international organizations led by my organization, Impact Iran, urged the United Nations Human Rights Council to hold an emergency session about the deteriorating situation in the country. We galvanized support from over 54% of the council, with only 12% voting against, to establish an independent international mechanism to investigate allegations of human rights violations and possible atrocity crimes, with a view to supporting future criminal proceedings. The mechanism is mandated to investigate the most serious and widespread patterns of human rights violations and abuses, including rights violations and systematic discrimination against women and girls, and the underlying structures that perpetuate them. This includes the use of force against peaceful protesters, arbitrary arrests, torture, rape, and summary killings of individuals in detention. Now, investigators must also identify parties that are responsible for committing these crimes, providing a critical avenue for alleged perpetrators of human rights violations to be held accountable in Iran. Now, the mechanism will also provide opportunities for human rights defenders to push for reforms at home. Using the findings of this mechanism, they can begin using these findings as a starting point for advocacy and policy reform campaigns aligned with their goals. Now, I'll just say that, importantly, the new mechanism focuses on gender persecution, and this will likely influence the support of Iranian women's human rights movements, allowing them to call attention to the criminal nature of the Iranian government's treatment of women, girls, and LGBT+ persons in practice and law. The movement this includes a movement that's currently underway to push states to recognize gender apartheid as a crime under international law. This past December, Iranian and Afghan women formed a coalition to expand the definition of apartheid beyond race to include gender, arguing that women in these countries face more than discrimination. The coalition highlights that women in these countries endure a calculated assault designed to dehumanize, repress, and repress them in order to maintain power. The hope is that, like in South Africa, the international community will continue to pressure regimes that suppress the human rights of women and girls, which eventually led to positive changes. Now, international pressure has already had one small effect. Just this past December, the UN Economic, Social, and Social Council removed Iran from its Commission on the Status of Women. That month, fueled by their successes in mobilizing support for the unprecedented investigative mechanism, and just 2 weeks before, Iranian human rights defenders crisscrossed all over Midtown Manhattan, driven by a resolve to mobilize support for a resolution that expressed concern over the Iranian government's actions to continuously undermine and increasingly suppress the human rights of women and girls, and often with the use of excessive force. Now, despite the unprecedented nature of the motion, because no UN member has ever been suspended from the Commission of the Status of Women for any reason, 54% of the 54-member body voted to remove Iran from the CSW, which is tasked with promoting gender equality and protecting human rights of girls and women worldwide. Only 8 countries voted against the proposal. Finally, just last month, the Coalition of Human Rights Advocates mobilized 23 members of the UN Human Rights Council to vote in favor of renewing the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran, with just 8 states voting against a resolution, which for the first time in 12 years included substantial language that reflects the extent and gravity of the human rights crisis taking place in Iran. Many are going to ask and have been debating about whether or not any of these actions and the protests in Iran have been a success or a failure in achieving their goals. Now, the recent protests in Iran have sparked this heated debate about their potential impact and outcome, and I would say that the protests represent a significant shift in the country's political dynamics, with Iranians from every socioeconomic background coming together to voice their frustration over corruption and mismanagement and political repression. Now, while some argue that they are merely a repetition of the past protests that have failed to bring about any real change, others, like myself, see them as a unique moment in the country's history. What is clear, though, is that this is not a simple case of unrest. These protesters represent a genuine grassroots movement that cuts across social classes and regional divides, demanding accountability from a government that has long been seen as corrupt and repressive. The fact that it has spread to every major city in the country, despite the risks and dangers involved, is a testament to the courage and passion of the Iranian people. Whatever the outcome, these protests are a powerful reminder that the desire for freedom and justice is in fact universal, and that people will continue to raise their voices and fight for their beliefs despite any of the great adversity they might face. But I'd like to say that the UN's recent warning that this new legislation and security officials are considering in terms of new measures for enforcing compulsory hijab laws, there are warnings that these laws would escalate into more detrimental and punishing actions against women and girls who disobey Iran's dress code, should serve as an alarm for all of us. In the aftermath of previous protests in Iran, Iran has opted to compensate for its crisis of legitimacy by resorting to harsher measures of repression and coercion to maintain control. Reports that various officials are deliberating on expanding the regime's arsenal of coercive enforcement tools suggest that Iranians face a prolonged struggle ahead. However, hope lies in the fact that brave people of Iran can overcome the situation, but they can't do it alone. They will need the help of the international community. And unlike the ones that came before, these protests present a unique opportunity for human rights monitors, advocates, and lawyers and analysts to support these efforts. The sheer scale and potential for large-scale repression mean that these protests require a coordinated and long-term strategy. As we work to hold the Iranian government accountable, we need to build networks, to work across borders, and to pool our resources and capacities. The stakes are high, but with our collective efforts, I think that we can overcome these challenges, and that if we support Iranian citizens in their struggle for human rights and democracy, they will eventually succeed. I want to thank you for your attention this evening.
Thank you, Rose, for that troubling yet hopeful presentation. And now for our only non-distaff panelist, Abed Awad. Abed and I go back far enough that the article we co-authored on Islamic bankruptcy law appeared in the International Lawyer 13 years ago. He's now with his law firm, Awad & Corey, and the founder and CEO of ShariaWiz.com. Besides being a powerful advocate for his native Palestine, Abed has devoted a major portion of his career to helping Muslim women protect their familial, marital, and custodial rights. And that is his topic tonight.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Robert. There's going to be a little bit of a shift here. So what we just heard was these political advocacy against authoritarian regimes and so forth. I'm not going to talk about political advocacy. I'm going to talk about women's rights and the trends that we're seeing in Muslim and Arab countries to effectuate social change. Not about winners and losers and black and white. It's a matter of actually affecting social change in a gradual and organic way that will be sustainable. So in this short talk, I'm going to have to provide you with a little bit of a comparative gender and law historical context so that we can understand my conclusion remarks and showing you what the trends are in that region. Western feminism often portrays Muslim women in the region as without autonomy, no agency or choice or ability to consent. That's secularism, and the Western experience of women liberation is the only way to gender equality or gender equity. Over 20 years of our occupation of Afghanistan and bombing them to the Stone Age, once we left, the headlines focused on every media outlet. We left Afghanistan, what happened with the Taliban, with the restrictions on women. No discussion of the devastation we caused with the occupation, and that we, the Americans, were the sponsors of the Taliban in their fight against communism. No discussion, and that distraction just fuels misinformation and fixates the focus on the poor Afghani women that we Western folk we need to save, not the failing policies and the war crimes that we committed in Afghanistan, which resulted in making it worse for Afghani women, not better. The problem is not the poverty, but it is religion, ultimately, what you're going to hear. Consciously or not is not the issue. But this discourse on women's rights sounds in a colonialist feminist discourse that in essence claims that Muslim women need to be liberated from their patriarchal culture, even if done through colonial intervention, whether military or in a civil form. Pay attention is that we're always going to interfere. Could be, let's bring this regime down so that we can affect women's rights. It is true that culture and many ideologies discriminate against women and contribute to the systemic inequity in the family. But poverty, war, and the lack of economic prosperity are the most damaging factors that affect women, more so than these abstract women feminist, Western feminist discourse. Poverty and war correlate directly with the practices of forced marriage, limited educational opportunity, limited property rights within the context of the family, more so than any other factors. So we need to have a comparative approach. A very dear colleague of mine said that a comparative approach is actually an epistemology. It creates knowledge. So how about how we faring out here in the United States? We incorrectly assume that women in America and in the West enjoy full autonomy. We fail to recognize that women everywhere do not enjoy full autonomy. Take, for example, the modest dress, and I know that me and my colleague may not see eye to eye on this. It's a cultural practice. This aspect of modest dress, which is a cultural norm, is ignored in the discussion. That the modest dress is cultural practice and corresponds to expectations from the community, not just for women, but for men, is equally ignored. Consider, for example, formal wear in America. Men wear tuxedos covering their entire body. Women wear dresses uncovering most of their bodies. Clothing, then, is not merely a matter of autonomy or choice. Clothing involves social norms, the market, peer pressure, politics, and what's considered sexy. Is modest dress a sign of oppression, as many Western feminists allege? Is modest dress a sign of, is non-modest dress to please the male gaze and sexualization of females a sign of oppression? Are consumer pressures and social expectations coercing American women's choice of their hairstyle or their clothing? Is there a difference between consumer pressure and social demand and cultural expectations to wear modest versus non-modest dress? Is the explosion of cosmetic surgery based on social and commercial pressures about aesthetic expectation? There's a 200% increase year after year in female genitalia cosmetic surgery. Is that a voluntary choice? Is there really a choice for women? Does having choice actually mean liberation? Despite the achievements of gender equality under the law in our country and in our society, we need to dig a bit deeper to understand the current state of women's human rights in our own country. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence found 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence and intimate physical abuse. 1 in 5 women in the United States have been raped in their lifetime. 19 million women in the United States have been stalked in their lifetime. 1 in 15 children in the United States observe and see intimate domestic violence against their parent. A few years ago, the Women in Film and Television with USA Today, so we'll talk a little bit about Hollywood, they did a survey in the entertainment industry, producers, actors, writers, directors. The survey asked them what was their experience in sexual misconduct in the place of work. The results were alarming. 94% of the women said they had experienced some form of harassment, assault, often by an older individual in a position of power over the accuser. 1/5 of the respondents said they have been forced to do some sexual act at least once. Only 1 in 4 women reported these experiences to anyone because of fear of personal retaliation in their job. Harvey Weinstein, case in point. So let's look at the historical context that gave rise to the birth of Western feminism. Coverture under the common law, which we have inherited, meant that a woman was legally considered the chattel of her husband, his possession. Any property she might hold before her marriage became the property of her husband on her wedding day. She had no legal right to appear in court, to sign contracts, or to do business. That a woman's existence was completely subsumed by her husband and was thoroughly explained by no other than Blackstone. And I quote, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated in that of the husband. Under his wing, protection, and cover, she performs everything, and her condition during her coverture. For this reason, a husband cannot grant anything to his wife, for the grant would be to suppose her separate existence, because she has no legal capacity or separate existence." In the 1840s, some states, not all, women would finally acquire legal status within marriage, gain the right to make contracts, to retain personal property, to be parties to lawsuits, and even execute their wills on their own behalf. But these new rights do not include a right to control over her own earnings. Her earnings were not hers. In 1876, the United States Supreme Court in Sitz versus Mitchell held that a statute that guaranteed married women the right to property they held before or during marriage did not extend to earnings. Not surprising, there was a legal requirement that a woman replace her own last name with that of the man she married. Even as late as 1945, the Illinois Court of Appeal held, and I quote, "It's well served by common law principles, an immemorial custom that a woman upon marriage abandons her maiden name and takes the husband's surname." In 1971, the Supreme Court affirmed without an opinion an Alabama requirement that a woman adopt her husband's name when applying and receiving a driver's license. Prior to 1981, so up to 1981, for example, under Iowa law, a petition for a name change of a married woman required the consent of her husband. Now let's examine so that's the socio-legal, political context for the rise of Western feminism. So now let's examine the legal, cultural context for the rise of Muslim feminism. Now, we're talking about the Middle East and North Africa. The Middle East and North Africa, when it comes to women and it comes to family law, is literally a plurally legal system, meaning each community has autonomy to determine the family law for their community. The Catholic family law is different than the Orthodox Christian family law, different than the Coptic Christian law, different than the Jewish family law. So each community had its own autonomy. We're only talking about Muslims today, so the time is limited. But keep in mind, in Arab countries, Christians are not able to get a divorce because divorce is not permitted. You would have to get an annulment. So there's a lot of issues regarding women's rights in the Christian and Jewish tradition in these Arab countries because of this legally pluralistic system. So now we talk about Islam. So let's start with just a Quranic framework. This is the Quran, chapter 7, verse 189. He is who created you from one soul, and from it made a spouse with whom you might find solace. So Islam, from the divine message, is that a woman and a man are from the same soul. It's not the rib of Adam. This divine message that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, carried to Arabs was a structural revolution against the tribal norms in pre-Islamic Arabia. The total overhaul of the rights and protections of women as a result of the moral message in the Quran included Muslim women had independent legal status, kept their maiden name, had legal capacity to contract, had the right to work, must consent to marriage, inherit and bequeath property, cannot be disinherited by will, own, manage, and dispose of property, entitled to sexual pleasure, can be religious scholars. A minority of scholars, even though that never made it to the majority, even said that women may be a judge. Ibn Hazm, a 12th century Andalusian scholar, said there's no prohibition on a Muslim woman to be a judge. Yes, it hasn't become mainstream, but the fact that we're talking in 9th, 10th, 11th century, there was discussion on whether a woman can be a judge should be quite telling. These rights vested and were established in the 7th century, 1,300 years before American women had the opportunity to have these rights. Yes, there's an issue about equality versus equity, but justice is more important than any of the other terminology that we use. Under the Sharia, the husband has an obligation to provide food, shelter, and clothing, including a domestic worker to help his wife. Financial obligations are gender specific. When we have discussions by Western feminists and so forth, you kind of take things out of a system. There was a system, a coherent system that functioned. There were obligations on men, obligations on women. But if we want to superimpose our conceptions, we are misconstruing and we're not reconstructing accurately how the system worked. In addition to these financial obligations, a husband had the obligation to provide sexual pleasure to his wife, something that in the West took up until modernity, until the middle of the 20th century. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah, that people consider one of the greatest scholars in the 13th century, he concluded that a wife is entitled to sex upon demand, and the only excuse for him not to provide sexual sex to his wife is if it takes him away from making a living. As we can see, when the Western women had no personhood, Muslim women had vast rights and they were empowered, civil, religious, and economic, and that was mainstream Islam. So here are these different contexts of the rise of the Western feminist movement. But despite this rich and substantial gender equity tradition in Islam, Muslim women today suffer discrimination, abuse, and marginalization. There's no question. But Muslim women do not need to go outside of their tradition, outside of their religious faith, to find authority and inspiration to develop an Islamic jurisprudence of female empowerment, independence, and equality. So what are the trends in the Muslim human rights in the region? The early feminist movement in the Middle East was inspired by Western feminism. But after almost 100 years of advocating a Western-based paradigm, it didn't make much progress. It was limited. So the changes they secured were not sustainable. As I explained earlier, the Western feminist experience arose from different objective social, political, religious, and cultural circumstances. These underpinnings for Western feminist paradigm and discourse are not universal, and they're not the same as other cultures. So Muslim women's social, legal, political, and religious experience is different. And to affect change, it has to be an indigenous approach to human women's rights and so forth. So it has to be organic to be sustainable. So with the failure of the Western approach, there's a new Muslim feminism was born, a feminism anchored in the faith and in the tradition, a unique feminism with a powerful voices and an authoritative foundation. Based on this moral message contained in the Quran, Muslim women feminists have been able to push for change. They want Muslim women to reclaim the rights that they already have. They push legislators to reform laws based on Islamic law arguments and authorities. Organizations like Karama, Muslim women lawyers for human rights in the United States, has been training Muslim women leaders for the past 30 years to raise awareness about how to use the marriage contract to secure rights and assert rights in order to level the playing field. We're looking for solutions, not abstract academic discussions. So you can use that marriage contract to affect change. You can level the playing field. I do it in my practice. I represent Muslim women. My entire dedicated career has been representing Muslim women and Arab women. I was the first male to be placed on Muslim women lawyers for human rights because of the work that I've done representing women in my private practice. So I see how these kind of methods can really result in change and protect women. In my practice, I see many women now in all the marriage contracts I draft, including the right for her to dissolve her marriage herself so that the husband doesn't have control. I see in the marriage contract issues regarding finances, marital residence, equal rights to initiate divorce, a right to go to work or to education. In inheritance, there are debates in Morocco about a daughter's share of inheritance when there's no son, based on the Quran and other Islamic authorities. So these Muslim women are moving towards staying within the indigenous tradition to make the changes. So you change organically. You're not replacing an entire religion and an entire system and applying New York law. So based on Islamic authorities, Muslim women have been successful in many countries to deal with domestic violence laws. They've expanded the right of custody in the event of a mother's remarriage in Iraq, for example. In Indonesia and Malaysia, women secured a share in the marital estate upon death or divorce. Iranian women passed legislation to codify the husband's requirement to provide financial support to be paid during the marriage, and if it wasn't paid during the marriage, that they would be entitled to it post-divorce. Saudi women passed a new family law that includes the most extensive expansion of guardianship rights for mothers in the region. It may not be perfect, it may not be equal, but it's the most extensive guardianship rights in the new Saudi law. Muslim women advocates have expanded their right to dissolve their marriage in Egypt, in Morocco, and other countries. So Muslim women feminists working within the tradition, like Aziz al-Hibri and Amina Wadood and Asma Barlas in the United States, Dr. Hind Shalaqani in Algeria, Shala Shakrat in Iran, Umayma Abu Bakr in Egypt, Hidayat Tuskal in Turkey, Asma al-Murabit and Buthaina al-Ghalbarzari in Morocco, and Zaina Anwar in Malaysia, and so many more of these Muslim women have provided theoretical framework for Muslim feminism anchored in Islamic tradition to affect and sustain change. They critique the patriarchal interpretations of the tradition with the objective to correct it and bring it back to the original message of the divine message of the Quran and of the Prophet Muhammad. We don't have to reject our faith to be liberated, is their mantra. These courageous women are reclaiming the moral message of the Quran to empower, protect, and liberate women. This feminism is indigenous and it's affecting change. Thank you.
Thank you, Abed. We'll save for another program the discussion of the theocratic disputes and schisms of the late 9th and 10th centuries that changed a lot of what the emphasis from a progressive Islam to a less progressive Islam of today. Anyway, thank you, Abed. Our next speaker, Lauren Schmidt, has blazed another amazing trail in assisting beset upon MENA region women. In her case, she is the Chief Experience Officer and founder of A Tree That Grows, an organization based in East Africa that is very active in assisting displaced women from the MENA region, in particular from Afghanistan and Pakistan. Laura is also a field instructor at Columbia University School of Social Work and is the leader for the summer and customized international programs of the membership group at NAFSA, the Association of International Educators. Lauren will tell us about challenges facing Afghani and Pakistani women in education and business.
First, I'm just so excited to be here. All of the presentations have just really, really inspired me. So thank you. So I want to start with a story. Last summer, I was on a Zoom call with one of my students from Pakistan who had returned to the country for the summer. And she was incredibly passionate about menstrual health, women's education, and advocacy. And she returned and she had designed a passion project and she had collaborated with groups and women in the country to run it. And when she was there, one of the initiatives that she worked on was to meet with the leader at a health center and to share her idea. And so she went and she shared what she was working on. And she expressed the collaboration she made and the work that she was doing. And when she shared with him her thoughts, his response was, "I'm not quite sure women want to talk about this right now." And so she shared this with her grandfather when she went back home in Lahore. And she was, of course, very discouraged. But she talked to him and she says, "I want to go talk with the women." And her grandfather was from the village and he agreed to accompany her and they went together. And when she went, she started to have conversations about menstrual health and how this impacted their education and the challenges that their daughters and sisters had experienced. And lo and behold, that the women actually were quite passionate about the subject and wanted to talk about it. And they shared with her. And this student, who for the purpose of this presentation I will call Fatima, returned to the leader of the healthcare center and shared her findings, and they ended up initiating the project. And on one of our conversations that we had in the Zoom call, she said something to me that for me has stood with me to today. She said, "Lauren, I wonder what would have happened had I not asked." And I'm an educator, and my job is generally to try to connect students to more learning resources. But when she asked that question, I didn't have much to say. I just looked at her and I said, "I think you're on the right track. Keep going." And before I go into discussing some of the experiences and challenges in education and economic opportunities for women in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I think there's something incredibly important that I need to say is that I am not from either one of the countries. And I just think that was brilliantly expressed in the last presentation, is that far too often women who are not from these nations often speak on behalf of the women who are actively leading change initiatives as we speak. So I really want to frame this discussion from a place of what's being done, who is doing the work, what are the challenges, but then also what are the opportunities, what are the areas for collaboration and growth, because I think there is so much being done in the area. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the challenges facing women in Afghanistan. And what's going on in the area. In 2021, the Taliban regained control of the country. And during that time, there were certainly a lot of questions and uncertainty, both within and outside of what this would look like for education and women's economic empowerment. And what quickly was found was that secondary schools were shut down, right? And I really want to sit with this for a minute here, because I think this, besides the obvious impact on educational trajectory, what that means for young women is so much, right? It often determines how young women are seen within their homes and their families and their communities. And when we look at the numbers, they can really be staggering here. Around 80% of school-age women, roughly 2.5 million, are out of school. And again, I'm hesitant to really put a lot of emphasis on the numbers because I don't want the numbers to paralyze us. So I just want to share that because I think it can, again, provide some context on what's happening on the ground. In December 2022, this was extended to universities. 100,000 university students were banned from attending. And again, when I hear those numbers, I just want to sit with the fact that while the doors were closed for women to attend, that doesn't mean that their dreams, their ideas, the innovations that they were working on were lost. They were still very, very, very much there. And I think this is certainly important to highlight here. This is additionally related and connected to what we're seeing in terms of the workforce for women. Women were banned in terms of both NGO work at the national level and international NGO level, as well as government. This certainly has an impact on the kind of programs and policies that relates to what women need. Because of course it kind of connects is that if the women who are receiving the services are not being designed by women, what is the outcome here? As we speak today, women are still banned from attending school. In March 2023, there was the question of whether schools would open. And again, despite de facto rhetoric, they remain closed. The economic implications are huge, resulting into loss of around $500 million for the Afghanistan economy here. I'm now going to transition and talk about what's going on in Pakistan. Certainly there's some similarities, but vast differences in looking at some of the challenges that young women are experiencing in the education sector here. So one of the unique things I think in this context here is that access and quantity doesn't always equal quality, right? So the idea that we can have a female in a classroom or a higher number of female students attending, but if that doesn't translate to access to secondary school or university, this can often impact what the lives of women will look like, both at university level and in the workforce. Roughly 2 million girls in Pakistan are out of school compared to young men. And I'm hesitant to, again, stand up here and directly link this to gender and culture because I think the root cause of this is much more complex than that. And there's certainly a lot of positionality in this here. But I think it's really interesting to note that 13% of students at the secondary school level are girls. Only 13% that reach 9th grade are young women. And you can kind of see the cycle here because it's all interconnected, right? In terms of how education is related to economic opportunities. I think it's also really important to look at and talk about how the floods have impacted the impact and access to schools and education in Pakistan. Here's a direct issue and look in terms of infrastructure, in terms of accessing schools. And I think this certainly begs the question of how do we not lose an entire generation of young minds, an entire generation of ideas, an entire generation of innovations, right, that are not coming from the West, that are not Western-based and imposed. And I think that is really, really critical here. So I want to transition now and look at some questions for us to explore, to look at here. I think one of the first questions I really want to look at is how do we navigate designing spaces and systems when policies may block access or natural disasters limit availability here? Secondly, how do we go beyond challenge identification to see new opportunities in the area? Certainly I think challenges themselves, particularly if it's coming from the context of sharing from someone who's not from the countries, can feel overwhelming and overbearing versus looking at what are the opportunities that are actually existing in this area, who's on the ground right now doing the work, advocating for change and making this progress, or working towards these goals. In that light, I want to really highlight here the opportunities for change. Who are some of the trailblazers? Who are some of these women who are actively working in this field, in this area to make a difference. The first woman, Shabana Basid Razik, I think is someone who had a really, really interesting model in the work that she is doing here. She started the Leadership Academy for Girls when she was a freshman at Middlebury College, and one of the things that I thought she did that was particularly interesting is, as she was designing roommates, she paired together girls who were from different backgrounds within the country. And again, I think that's really interesting because it certainly begs the question of how do we develop and sustain new ways for inclusion and tolerance that are not Western imposed, right? And I think that is really a remarkable kind of question and how we get looking at that. Of course, when the Taliban ban came for education in 2021, her school, the first and only boarding school for women in Afghanistan, closed down. So what she did, and I think it was just incredibly remarkable in terms of the collaborations and partnerships that ensued, is that even before the August of 2021, partnerships were formed with both the government of Rwanda and the IOM. And there is a new school that is established in Rwanda. But I think that also begs the question, it got me thinking in a lot of the conversation I've been having today is, yes, while there's around 200 students, 200 young women from Afghanistan continuing their education in Rwanda, that certainly begs the question of what happens to those that are left behind. And I do not say that from the perspective of, removing empowerment or opportunities, but what happens when someone can't leave? And I think that is the question we need to really look at, and the solutions and opportunities will only come from within. She established incredible collaborations in doing this, and I think it certainly begs the question of how do we leverage partnerships? How do we develop networks to work for a common good? Because I think she recognized that, I don't want to lose a generation. These are going to be the next leaders. These are going to be the next generation of people influencing families, influencing communities here. But I also think it's important to share that she's very clear that the intention is not to come up with a subchapter of this school in Rwanda. The intention is to return home. And I think that is really, really powerful. Some of the other work that is being done in this, when we look at Maria Umar in Pakistan from the Women's Digital League, and I think what she did, which was really, really incredible and really innovative here, is connecting via digital learning platform, both training opportunities and workforce connections here. So I think this is really interesting because it certainly begs the question of, if women can't get to work, can we bring work to women, right? And the same thing applies with schools and education. We see when we look at the Malala Fund here in terms of the collaboration and the connection that she made with Vodacom, using mobile technology to bridge the literacy gap. This certainly begs the question of how can we foster these kinds of initiatives, these kinds of opportunities for collaboration, versus wait and sit and see what happens. And I think I want to now just transition in terms of looking forward into what's next. And these are two kind of guiding questions that I'd like for us to lead with and explore together. Is what are the opportunities to address issues regarding learning and economic development and business in these countries? I think sometimes when we look at numbers, they can paralyze us. We see the numbers or we see the statistics and they, it overwhelms and it can feel like, we need to shut down. So I think my second question to that leads to, how do we keep exploring? How do we keep seeing and keep innovating from the extent of what's already being done on the ground? Because the answers will be found there. I think that's where the innovations are happening. That is where the creativity is to be found, and it is certainly not coming from outside as we've seen. And as we speak, women are doing that. And I think I really want to highlight and honor that. And it goes back, I know I was reading this interview that Shabana Basid Razik had, and she was talking about a conversation she had with her father. And he said, they can take property and they can take money, but they can never take what's up here. And I extend that to, you can never take also what's in here. So I want us to, keep looking at what does it look like to keep asking women. I think that is the core question here. How do we keep asking and not assuming, but keep exploring for the women who are on the ground doing the work, creating their own change? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I will say it. Last but certainly not least is my dynamic, multi-talented, and peripatetic co-chair of the MENA Committee, the Honorable Elizabeth S. Stong, United States bankruptcy judge for the Eastern District of New York. Elizabeth is the Waldo of jurists, always emailing me from a different continent. But she is not a casual traveler. Her trips almost always serve a human rights and her judicial independence and educational purpose, and many to this region. So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce the nonpareil Judge Elizabeth Stong to educate us about the progress and challenges facing women jurists in the MENA region and U.S. programs to assist them.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Boy, everyone should have the privilege of being introduced by this guy at some point in their lives. I'm mindful of the hour. I'm grateful for your presence. Please indulge me for just a couple of minutes. I'll keep it short, really. Those of you who know me don't believe me, but I will. First, we have to thank Bob Michael. Your work on this program to make this happen is extraordinary. What a night we've had. What a group we've got. And it's the committee's program. We have many wonderful co-sponsors. You're seeing the results of Bob's work, Bob's dedication to make this happen. Please join me in thanking my extraordinary co-chair, Bob Michael. Thank you, Bob. And just a word, Kevin, I see you. Thank you, Kevin, for sticking it out with us and making all of this happen. I'm going to take just a couple minutes. I'm looking at the time to see if I can make this a tiny bit relatable. It's hard to do that when you think about the depth and breadth and sobering nature, troubling nature, uplifting nature of so many things that we've heard. My story in the region is a small story, but I think that's maybe why it's helpful. Someone on this panel needs to have a small story. That's me. Hopefully it's relatable. I'm a judge. I work for you, the people of the United States. I'm a bankruptcy judge. I work in a court that gives companies a second chance, saves jobs, hopefully preserves going concern value if you're an economist. I work in a court that gives families a chance to save their homes, and we really mean it. I work in a court that gives individuals that are a little bit overcome by their debt a chance to put that behind them and get a fresh start. I work in a court, the purpose of which is in Article 1 of the United States Constitution. There should be a second chance. Check it out, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4. Pardon me, and I work in a court where I talk a lot, so I'm losing my voice. It's been a busy week. My work in the MENA region began at my second year on the bench when I came back from picking up my lunch and had a message to call Washington that they wanted me to go to Algeria. Go where? Algeria? It's been a year in France, but I had a general sense, but not a specific sense. And that started me on a path. I went to Algeria in 2004 with a law clerk, actually, to work with their judges and to help make their courts better, to help make judges understand their role was to be problem solvers, to do justice, that there was no inconsistency between doing justice and being problem solvers. And asking, have you thought about ways that we could move this forward is actually a good question, not an impermissible question, even if you don't find it in the civil code. And most countries, you probably know, are not common law like ours, they're civil law. So my work began there, and it began not at the high level of governments and systems and revolutions, but with 17 judges at the Judicial Training Center in Algiers. My first thought was, is anyone going to listen to me? I'm a second-year judge. I am female. 10 of that 17 judges with whom I worked for many years and whom I had as dinner guests at my home when they came here, 10 of those judges are women. They're my inspiration from the beginning of my career on the bench. I went from Algeria next, because it went kind of well there, actually. Tunisia was my next stop with the École Supérieure de la Magistrature. There's an acronym to work with the judges there, to work in the same concepts. And the group was about half men and women. You would not find that proportion here in the United States, by the way, to your point, sir. And so, of course, we began each morning. We were received very graciously by the director in her very large, very beautiful office, in the corner of which hung her Supreme Court robe. She'd retired from the Supreme Court to take on this task. A woman setting the tone and the agenda for the training of women and men judges in Tunisia. From there, next I went to Egypt. This is over, it wasn't just one long trip. This was over a period of time. as I continued to connect with, relate to, and see the opportunities in the women and men, but I'll say especially often with bonds with the women, and the work that we do in civil justice, in problem-solving courts, in courts that are grounded in respect for everyone and good process and good outcomes, and a toolkit to make that happen. And in Egypt, one way or another, I wound up with the opportunity to train all the junior judges in their economic court to be conciliators, to be mediators. Many of those junior judges were women. Many of the senior judges, to my great delight, were also women. I will never forget the night that 3 of them came up after we finished our day's work and said, "So, you want to go to the pyramids?" I said, "Sure, let's go to the pyramids." And in a, I'll say, rattletrap VW bug, off we went through the streets of Cairo. Colleagues, inspirations, friends, sisters, judges in Egypt. From Egypt to Jordan, where we worked on law reform, writing statutes to help their courts be problem-solving courts, not punitive courts when people or company can't pay their bills. You don't send them to prison. How does that help? Many systems still do, actually. To Lebanon, where I worked with a group that was similarly focused on trying to make the laws work better and to write good laws, and against the background of a pretty tough time in Beirut when I was connecting through Paris. The lead story on the French version of CNN was that there'd been shooting in the streets of Beirut that night. I'm on my way to Beirut. I have a young child. And I'm thinking, we don't have to do this. I called the World Bank. Lots of different sponsors of these programs. We don't have time. But I called the World Bank person who I was meeting, who was coming from Istanbul, saying, have you looked at the, if this is not a good day to meet at the president's office, that's fine. There's plenty of flights back to New York. No. And we went, we met with entrepreneurs and legislatures. And again, many women, more than half of the entrepreneurs are women, who just want a shot to make their system work. Ground up, one by one. This is why I'm hoping this is relatable, because some of us are going to be Nobel laureates, but not many of us. And the rest of us, I think, have this opportunity that we may have to stop and look and see that we have to recognize that it's right there in front of us. And then I guess I'll end with my most unusual piece of this kind of work that I've done in connection with Bahrain, and Bob knows where I'm going with this because he's had to hear about it from time to time. I've worked in Bahrain, been there a couple of times, and was going back in April of 2020. Well, you can imagine what happened to that return trip. We put it off to May because all U.S. government official travel was on a hard stop. And when there was a suggestion that we were going to have to put it off again because U.S. government official travel was still on a hard stop, the ministry there said, well, we'd like to set up a weekly meeting with Judge Stong. I mean, they know me well. I've worked with them for some time. And a weekly meeting, we've never done this because we never do it because we have to go, right? We have to get on a plane and be there in person. I love being in person. But for the next few years, and including last Tuesday, I spent an hour with the judges in Bahrain, one in particular who has the restructuring, the business rescue caseload, kind of like mine. Some of the largest companies in the region have reorganized successfully in her courtroom. She's one of my best friends. She's my hero. One judge at a time. It's relatable. You know people you can have these conversations with. Open your eyes. Say yes when you get the chance. So that's my story. I guess I'll end with the story I actually told at my swearing in as a judge about starfish. I'm from the Bay Area, San Francisco. We have tides in, out. A high tide will sometimes wash a bunch of starfish up. And the tide goes out and the starfish dry out because they don't necessarily all float away. And a dried out starfish is a dead starfish. And so the story is that a marine biologist and her daughter, little girl, were walking along the beach and they're seeing all these starfish. And little girl's picking them up and tossing them back. And the mom says, honey, why are you bothering? Honestly, you can't make a difference. Look at all these starfish. And she picks up the next one, tosses it back, and says, made a difference to that one. So look for the starfish. Hopefully this is a little bit relatable. Remember, you can do it top down. God knows we need people and organizations that do it top down, but you can also do this work bottoms up sometime. It's been my privilege to do that. And I hope on that note, we can say thank you again, Bob, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, you all. I hope you all enjoyed this nearly as much as I did. It's been a great honor and privilege to hear such wonderful speakers. I'm so glad we were able to do this, and I look forward to our committee and this organization continuing the work that we really started in 2005 and bringing to New York, bringing to the legal community, bringing to the world more knowledge and information about the Middle East, North Africa, Islamic law and finance. And again, just very, very appreciative. Of course, it's an honor and a privilege to have a Nobel Peace Prize Laureate among us, but we have future Nobel Peace Prize Laureates and others who are all just tremendous contributors, have done their part, macro, micro, and in between. And I hope you join me in thanking them all one more time. As they say on TV, that's our show. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions and answers.
I'm back next year.
Thank you.